Thank you all for coming. Good to see some familiar faces, old friends, groupies, and new faces. There's some people whom I don't recognize, and that's a treat as well. Pete Seeger died on January 27th, 2014, at the age of 94. I was very moved by his death, having admired and followed him since I was 16 years old. It was almost as if a piece of me had died as well. I wrote this lecture as a celebration of an extraordinary legacy, as a collective tribute to an extraordinary man. I lovingly dedicate the next hour or so to Pete's memory. Can I ask how many of you have seen Pete Seeger in concert? Oh, would have been easier to ask how many of you have not seen Pete in concert. Those of you who have seen him know how much importance he attached to people singing together. To make this happen, he borrowed extensively from the call and response structure of African American spirituals, wherein somebody sings a line, that would be me, and everyone else echoes it back, that would be you. I'm on my way. I'm on my way to freedom land. Freedom land. I'm on my way. I'm on my way to freedom land. Freedom land. Well, I'm on my way. I'm on my way to freedom land. Freedom land. On my way. On my way. Great God, I'm on my way. Ask my mama, come with me. I said, sweet mama, won't you come with me? Well, ask my mama, won't you come with me? On my way, great God, on my way, won't turn back, on my way, yeah, won't turn back, well, I'm on my way, yeah, won't turn back. On my way, great God, I'm on my way. Thank you. You're all in pretty good form, I would say. On October 22nd, 2011, Arlo Guthrie showed up at Columbus Circle in New York to join the burgeoning Occupy Wall Street movement. As he approached the makeshift podium, cameras started clicking, people started cheering, and there was a palpable excitement in the air. But it was not only Woody Guthrie's son that created this stir, it was his elderly companion, a frail, 92-year-old gentleman walking slowly and deliberately with the aid of two canes. It was this man, Pete Seeger. That day, as he had done for the previous 70 years, Pete led the crowd in collective singing. What do you think they sang? Yes, they sang We Shall Overcome, of course. But they also sang a gospel song written in 1920 for children, which has become a generic protest song in its own right. No. Do I hear This Little Light of Mine? This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. Let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Way down on Wall Street, we're gonna let it Thank you. Who is this man that inspired such excitement that day at Columbia Circle in New York? The man who is globally respected and is at the same time an American icon. Now that word icon is often used loosely and gratuitously, but in this case, it is undoubtedly, without question, appropriate. What I want to do in the brief time we have this evening is to present what I consider the major highlights in Pete Seeger's life, focusing on his contribution to the civil rights movement, the labor movement, the environmental and anti-war movements. He contributed to all of them. He was a busy man, a passionate and a busy man. At various points, as you've already seen, you have the opportunity to sing with me, a process of which Pete would heartily approve. He believed passionately in the power of song to develop community and to rally people to social action. Pete was born in Manhattan in 1919. His parents were patrician New Englanders. They could trace their lineage back to the Mayflower. Pete Seeger's father, Charles Louis Seeger, was an ethnomusicologist of renown. Charles Louis Seeger. You see the resemblance? He was a passionate collector of American folk music, and during this process, he developed very strong leftist views. Forced to resign his professorship at Berkeley because of this in 1918. Pete's mother, Constance de Cliver Edson, was a classical violinist and teacher. His stepmother, Ruth Crawford Seeger, was one of the most significant American composers of the 20th century. So what a background. What a family background. He was therefore exposed very early on in his life, Pete was, to the two elements that would stay with him throughout the rest of his life: music and leftist ideology. I've been fortunate to have been able to communicate with Pete in the past. I initially sent him a copy of one of the courses I was doing at Carleton on the history of protest music. I sent him an outline, asking him, saying to him, maybe you'd be interested in this, not hoping realistically for a response from an American icon. But lo and behold, 2 weeks later, I received a set of responses to a series of questions I had asked him. And also, he sent back my course outline with a series of comments. I was blown away. A busy guy, took the time to do this. And his comments were very encouraging. I was very reinforced in reading them. And I asked him some biographical questions. And one of the questions I was asking him was what the catalyst was, or catalysts were, for his initial involvement in protest singing. He responded that among the important influences was this man, his father. Quote, this is Pete Seeger saying to me, quote, as a teenager with a lefty father and lefty friends, I had to learn old protest songs, unquote. It was mandatory in that household, apparently. And of course, Charles Louis Seeger was also an ethnomusicologist, so there was plenty for Pete to learn. In 1935, at age 16, Pete traveled with his dad to attend the 9th annual Asheville, North Carolina Folk and Dance Festival. There, for the first time in his life, Pete heard this. A 5-string banjo. And Pete was riveted He spent the next 4 years mastering the instrument. His Protestant work ethic came to the fore, and he focused virtually exclusively on learning the banjo. By the age of 20, he could do things on this instrument that very few people, even today, are able to accomplish. Here's a picture of Pete in one of his early performances, performing before the troops in 1940 on Valentine's Day. You recognize the woman in the middle? Yes. Eleanor Roosevelt, who was a big fan of Pete's. Allegedly, she was enamored of Pete, loved his music, loved his idealism. 1936 was a key year for Seeger. He entered Harvard, the start of a very short university career. Secondly, that year, he met this fellow. Of course he did. Alan Lomax, the prolific American folk song collector. Pete met him in 1936. Alan Lomax was one of the great field collectors of folk music. He would go off with his huge clunker of a tape recorder. Remember those huge tape recorders? He would go off with his father. They would visit work camps, prisons, union halls, and record all the songs that they found of interest. Alan Lomax died in 2002. But from 1937 to 42, he was assistant in charge of the Archive of Folk Music at the Library of Congress in Washington, to which he and his father contributed literally thousands of folk songs. So 36, he goes into Harvard. Second thing that happened, he met Alan Lomax. Thirdly, that year, he met this woman and her family. That woman, some of you may know who she is. Does anyone? That's Molly Jackson. She was the matriarch of a Kentucky mining family. And she was invited to New York to record some of her mining protest songs. And Pete met her and her family, including Jim Garland and Sarah Ogan, the entire Jackson clan. And he said to me in one of his correspondences that the second most important influence in his life, apart from his father first, was the meeting, secondly, of this songwriting family from Kentucky, led by this authentic, I have to say, no pretense. Look at her face. Gaunt. The trials that she went through, endured as the wife of a miner and as the mother of boys who went into the mine as well. Their authentic portrayal through song of worker exploitation in the mines of Kentucky awoke Pete's nascent concern with issues of social justice. So they were a second very major influence in Pete's life. 1938, Pete dropped out of Harvard. He had a partial scholarship, but he became increasingly involved with radical politics and folk music, and his grades suffered, and he lost his scholarship. Now, I'm a sociologist. I was trained as a sociologist, so I'm a little bit sheepish to report that one of the factors that may have pushed Pete out of Harvard was his experience in a sociology class, where the professor allegedly told him, "Don't think you can change the world. The only thing you can do is to study." That was anathema to Pete. Pete wanted to change the world. sociology was not the answer for Pete. So that might have been part of the reason he left Harvard. In 1939, because of Pete's connection with Alan Lomax, he got a job as intern in the archive of American folk songs at the Library of Congress. Listen to this now. This was Pete's job. Can you think of a more ideal job for this man? He was supposed to listen to the stacks of recordings that Lomax had collected and to sort them into piles which represented the best of American folk music. He was like a sponge, absorbing all the lyrics and music of the songs he found of interest. He was like a kid in a candy store. This was the perfect job for Pete Seeger as a young man. Now, in 1940, Lomax asked Pete to play at a concert. It was a John Steinbeck-inspired benefit concert for agricultural workers. Pete did, but he was clearly nervous, and he sat down to polite applause. But on the same program was this fellow. We know who he is? Woodrow Guthrie, named Woodrow by his father after Woodrow Wilson, but from then on called Woody. And he is a Woody. He's not a Woodrow. Woody had just arrived from New York City. Lomax introduced Pete and Alan Lomax, and folk music would never be the same again. And Guthrie got up and performed. And he was an imp. He was mischievous, he was funny, he wrote original songs, and he sang them in a benign yet profound way. That's the only way I can, if you've heard Guthrie sing, you know what I mean. And Lomax was just intrigued with Guthrie's performance. So he invited Guthrie to the Library of Congress to record his songs. Soon after, Guthrie and Seeger were working together. What they were doing was selecting the songs that Alan Lomax wanted to put together into a book called, he generally wanted it to be Songs of Social Justice. So Pete and Woody were working together on this book. And Pete came up with a brilliant name for this book, which was published finally in 1967. Do you know the name that he picked? Anybody have a history of that? Hard-hitting Songs for Hard-Hit People. Isn't that beautiful? Hard-hitting songs for hard-hit people. John Steinbeck introduced the collection. Guthrie annotated each song. And Pete transcribed and edited the songs. That was the division of labor. The key point here is that Pete and Woody became very close friends during this process. Now, as I told you, I asked Pete questions on the catalyst for his interest in protest music. And he responded, as you recall, his father, the Kentucky mining family led by Molly Jackson. And thirdly, he said to me, as if that said it all, quote, at age 20, I met Woody Guthrie, unquote. And this was arguably, Woody Guthrie was arguably the most important figure in Pete's life, next to his father. Guthrie ripped Seeger from his middle-class complacency and led him on a journey which lasted his whole lifetime. Pete says in his wonderful book, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? My life was never the same again. What a pair, think of it. Hard drinking, smoking, womanizing, freight train riding, Oklahoman, Guthrie, and this shy, non-drinker, non-smoker kid from New England. Guthrie reportedly said on meeting Seeger, quote, "That Seeger guy is the youngest man I know." In 1940, as part of a burgeoning labor movement, Pete was involved in founding this group of singers. This group was precursor to the Weavers, founded by Pete in 1940, the Almanacs, the Almanac Singers. Now, interestingly, here's a bit of trivia for you at the next folk cocktail party that you go to. You could trot this out. Pete didn't use his own name as a member of the Almanacs because he didn't want to compromise his father's career. His father was a communist. He was already kicked out of one university for his communist leanings, so he didn't want to use his name Seeger. What name did he call himself? Peter Bowers. Don't ask me why. I think it had something to do with Bower, flowers, I don't know. But he called himself Peter Bowers. Now, do you know why they call themselves the Almanacs? It's interesting that they chose that name. They were sitting around in their Greenwich Village apartment talking about books that had influenced them. And Lee Hayes, in his wonderful Arkansas accent, which I will not try to duplicate, said, when I was growing up, I am trying. When I was growing up, there were only two books in the house. There was the Bible, to help get us through the next world, and the Almanac, to help us get through this world. And somebody said, and I think it was Millard Lampell, we're going to help people get through this world. Let's call ourselves the Almanacs. And they thought that was perfect. So they became the Almanac Singers. Now the Almanac Singers lasted only a year. And they only left behind 36 songs, 36 songs. And their work was extremely controversial in some places, popular in other places, but mostly controversial. Because they were part of a group called the Popular Front. Does that ring a bell? An alliance during the 30s of liberals and leftists who had vowed to put aside their differences in order to fight fascism and promote racial and religious inclusiveness and workers' rights. The Almanac Singers felt strongly that songs could aid in these objectives. They were the first, I would argue, there may be another, but I don't know, the first group, folk group, explicitly organized for political objectives, to attain political objectives. Their core lineup were to influence several generations of musicians, songwriters, singers. Indeed, their influence is still felt today, and there are groups playing today that don't know that they've been influenced by these guys because of the indirect connection between the Almanacs and a whole series of groups down the line from 1940 on. What the group did also, very importantly, was solidify the relationship between Pete Seeger and Woody Guthrie. Two of the best known and most creative and politically astute folk singers ever. Their apartment in the East Village in New York became known as the Almanac House. And it was a hotbed of gatherings of intellectuals, left-leaning artists, writers, musicians. Their initial political stance was virulently pro-worker and anti-American involvement in World War II. The former expressed by their collection of labor songs, the latter by their anti-war songs. We'll get into their labor songs momentarily, but I want to start by looking at their anti-war position. Any historians here? No, you're afraid to admit it because you know I'm going to ask a question. What happened in 1939 of interest? Some of you were born in 1939, probably.
Spanish Civil War.
39?
39, okay. Yeah. that was an important event. But what happened, essential for our purposes, is a non-aggression pact signed between the Soviet Union and Germany. So the Soviet Union and Germany were essentially allies. Because of this, the Almanacs and many communist sympathizers took an avowedly pro-peace and isolationist position, because they didn't want the US to enter the war and essentially be fighting against their brethren, the Soviets. And because of this, the Almanacs decided they would give a series of anti-war concerts, and they did. Those concerts were very popular in the lefty circles on the East Coast of New England. They developed a repertoire of anti-war and anti-Roosevelt songs in particular. They released a record album called Songs for John Doe. John Doe is a hypothetical American soldier. And among those songs was a song called The Strange Death of John Doe, which described a hypothetical death by bayonet of an American soldier who was just drafted. Also on that album was a song called Franklin D. Franklin D, listen to me, you ain't gonna send me across the sea. Across the sea, across the sea, ain't gonna send me across the sea. Well, this created a furor in some circles. A Harvard professor, ironically from Harvard, given Pete's background, deemed the Almanacs treasonous, and their songs, quote, a matter for the Attorney General, because they were, quote, subversive of military recruitment and morale. In 1941, in June of that year, however, Hitler broke the non-aggression pact and attacked the Soviet Union. So the Almanac's anti-war position was no longer tenable. A truth driven home by the U.S. entry of the war on December 8th, 1941, after Pearl Harbor. So their anti-war songs were history. Indeed, copies of that album, Songs for John Doe, were all destroyed only a month after their release. But the Almanacs were nothing if not survivors. In the interest of survival, they did a complete 180 and wrote a song of reconciliation with FDR. Now, Mr. President, we haven't always agreed in the past, I know, but that ain't all important now. What is important is what we gotta do. We gotta lick Mr. Hitler. Until we do, other things can wait. In other words, we got a skunk to skin. They followed this up with other pro-war songs. Notably, this not too subtle ditty. I wish I had a bushel, wish I had a pet, wish I had a rope to tie round old Hitler's neck. Round and round Hitler's grave, round and round we'll go. Gonna lay that poor boy down, he won't get up no more. Mussolini won't last long, tell you the reason why. We're gonna salt his beef and hang it up to dry. Round and round Hitler's grave, round and round we'll go. Gonna lay that poor boy down, he won't get up no more. Well, but this blatant anti-war to pro-war position was not enough to save the Almanacs. The day after they sang Round and Round Hitler's Grave on national radio, their leftist past caught up with them with a vengeance. A headline in a major New York paper read, quote, "Commie singers try to infiltrate radio." No more radio gigs after that. But even their labor songs were no longer viable. A year earlier, the AFL and CIO and other prominent unions announced a no-strike pledge for the duration of the war. So labor protest songs were out just as anti-war songs were out. They were both defined as blatantly patriotic and anti-patriotic, and nobody wanted to hear that material. The Almanac Singers disbanded only a year after their coming into existence. And the major and somewhat ironic nail in the coffin was Pete Seeger entering the army. He was drafted in July of 1942. Now, the Almanacs had a powerful effect on the labor movement. Their songs were not only recorded for wide public consumption, but they were living, vital entities. They were sung at labor rallies, picket lines, and at benefits for various workers' groups. In my mind, Seeger's major contribution to this collection of labor songs was his composition in 1940 with Millard Lampell of a song called Talking Union. It was patterned, as so many labor protest songs were, it was patterned after an African-American spiritual, which began, "If you want to get to heaven, let me tell you what to do." The fascinating thing about this spiritual, which I will sing for you in a minute, is that it's less melodic than it is speech. The early spirituals, as you probably know, were typically sung a cappella without musical accompaniment. They consisted essentially of talking over rhythm. Talking over rhythm. Does this evoke a contemporary genre of music? Rap. Indeed, such spirituals predated by over 100 years. Spirituals did this supposedly contemporary, innovative type of music we call rap. And I think we've lost that history, that rap really emerged from spirituals that were literally rapped without musical accompaniment. I'm going to rap the words to this traditional spiritual in a second. Now I'll do it now. If you want to get to heaven, let me tell you what to do. You got to soak your feet in a little mutton stew. You got to slide out of the devil's hand. Ooze over into the promised land. Take it easy. Go greasy. I was down in the hen house on my knees when I thought I heard a chicken sneeze. It was only the rooster saying his prayers, thanking the Lord for the hens upstairs. Rooster preaching, hens is singing. Little young pullets doing the best they could. I said, little young pullets doing the best they could. Now, Pete Seeger discovered this, and he and Millard Lampell took this format and wrote a brilliant text to accompany it, Talking Union. I'm going to play Pete singing it in a minute, but I want you to note two things about the song. First, notice how they've modified two key lines. If you want to get to heaven becomes, if you want higher wages. Take it easy, go greasy becomes, take it easy, but take it. The second thing I would ask is that while we're playing this song, I would ask you to close your eyes and listen to it. I want you to focus on the song. It's brilliant. The words are very clever. So we're going to play it now. Close your eyes and listen to the song.
Now, if you want higher wages, let me tell you what to do. You got to talk to the workers in the shop with you. You got to build you a union, got to make it strong. But if you all stick together, boys, 'twon't be long. You get shorter hours, better working conditions, vacations with pay, take a kid to the seashore. It ain't quite this simple, so I better explain just why you got to ride on the union train. 'Cause if you wait for the boss to raise your pay, we'll all be awaiting till Judgment Day. We'll all be buried, gone to heaven. St. Peter will be the straw boss then. Now you know you're underpaid, but the boss says you ain't. He speeds up the work till you're about to faint. You may be down and out, but you ain't beaten. You can pass out a leaflet and call a meeting, talk it over. speak your mind. Decide to do something about it. Of course, the boss may persuade some poor damn fool to go to your meeting and act like a stool, but you can always tell a stool, oh, that's a fact. He's got a yaller streaker running down his back. He doesn't have to stool. He'll always get along on what he takes out of blind men's cups. You got a union now and you're sitting pretty. Put some of the boys on the steering committee. The boss won't listen when one guy squawks, but he's got to listen when the union talks. He'd better be mighty lonely. Everybody decide to walk out on him. Suppose they're working you so hard it's just outrageous and they're paying you all starvation wages. You go to the boss and the boss would yell, before I raise your pay I'd see you all in hell. Well, he's puffing a big cigar, feeling mighty slick because he thinks he's got your union licked. Well, he looks out the window and what does he see but 1,000 pickets, and they all agree he's a bastard. Unfair! Slave driver. Bet he beats his wife. Now, boys, you come to the hardest time. The boss will try to bust your picket line. He'll call out the police, the National Guard. They'll tell you it's a crime to have a union card. They'll raid your meeting. They'll hit you on the head. They'll call every one of you a goddamn red unpatriotic. Japanese spies. Sabotaging national defense. But out at Ford, here's what they found, and out at Vultee, here's what they found, and out at Alice Chalmers, here's what they found, and down at Bethlehem, here's what they found. That if you don't let red baiting break you up, and if you don't let stool pigeons break you up, and if you don't let vigilantes break you up, and if you don't let race hatred break you up, you'll win. What I mean, take it easy, but take it.
Every time I hear his voice, there's a French expression, verklempt, you know that? It's not really French. But every time I hear that alto, amazing voice. So I think that's a brilliant composition, and it played very well for a while, and it's still sung. In 1942, year after I was born. Yeah, I know, hard to believe. Pete Seeger became a member of the Communist Party, a decision which would haunt him for decades. He eventually, quote, drifted away, in Pete's own words, in the late 40s and early 50s. And in 1943, a momentous year for Pete, he married this person. Look at that. Isn't that beautiful? You know what his wife's name was? Toshi. Toshi Aline Ota, whom he credits with being the support that helped make the rest of his life possible. Joan Baez was once asked whether she thought Toshi was a martyr. And she said no, Toshi was a saint. Now Toshi, I'm just going to go a little off the trajectory of the lecture just to tell you a bit about Toshi, because she is not often given the credit she deserves. She's usually depicted as a supporter of Pete, enabling him to live the life that he lived. But Toshi was a remarkable woman in her own right. She was a festival organizer, she was a human rights activist, and she was a film producer. Indeed, she produced the award-winning documentary of Pete's life called The Power of Song. How many of you have seen The Power of Song? Not enough of you, I would say. It's marvelous. If you have seen it, watch it again. Toshi also had a wonderful sense of humor. Quote, "If only Pete would chase women instead of causes, I would have an excuse to leave him." Amazing. Toshi died in the summer of 2013 at the age of 91. They were married 70 years. At one point, Pete said to his granddaughter, "There is not a sunset go by that I don't miss her terribly," unquote. And I'm sure Pete's passing 6 months later was exacerbated by Toshi's death. In 1948, the Almanacs were reconstituted as this group. Now, there are the Weavers. Do you know their names? Okay, left. Ronnie Gilbert.
Pete Seeger.
Next.
Lee
Hayes. And
Fred
Hellerman, who's often forgotten. But they've all passed away now. Fred Hellerman was the last surviving Weaver. He died in September of last year. And he played until the end. He performed until the end. In fact, he performed at Pete Seeger's memorial concert at Lincoln Hall. Do you know how they got their name, the Weavers? Anyone hazard a guess? It came from the title of a play by Nobel Prize winner Gerhard Hauptmann called The Weavers, which was a play based on a Silesian workers' strike, which contained the lines that Pete loved. Quote, "We'll stand it no more, come what may," unquote. The Weavers were tremendously influential. They sang mainly the songs that Pete collected during his time at the Library of Congress, with others left over from the almanacs. As a 16-year-old, I was mesmerized by their wonderful harmonies. How many remember the Weavers? How many? Wow, amazing. I was mesmerized by their harmony, by their political messages, and by Pete's wonderful work on the banjo. I wanted to sing their songs, and I wanted to play the banjo like Pete. I did sing their songs, and I still do. But alas, I don't play like Pete. The Weavers attained amazing success. Their string of major hits began with, what was their first? Those of you Weaver aficionados?
Good Night, Irene.
It wasn't Good Night, Irene. That was a big one, but that wasn't their first. Smokey. Not Smokey the Bear, though. And then, you preempted this, but amazingly unheard of for a folk song, an arrangement of an old Leadbelly song topped the charts for 13 weeks in 1950. On a Saturday night I got married. Me and my wife settled down. Now me and my wife, we're parted. Gonna take a stroll downtown. Irene, good night, Irene. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dream. Anybody got a verse out there? I just sang that one. Another one.
Sometimes I live in the country.
In the country.
Sometimes I live in town. Sometimes I get a great notion
Just to jump into the river and drown. Irene, good night, Irene. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you stop your rambling.
Stop you gambling.
Stop your gambling. Stop staying out late at night. Go home to your wife and family. Stay there by your fireside night. Irene, good night. Irene, good night. Good night, Irene. Good night, Irene. I'll see you in my dreams. Here's a trivia question for you. What was on the flip side of Good Night, Irene?
Tenna, tenna.
La, 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 la. Yes, that was it. Very good. So the Weavers in 1950, from 1950 to 1953, were at the top of the world. It all came crashing down, though, due largely to this man. Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy. From which state?
Nebraska.
No. Wisconsin. Give the man, is there any more gold stars? Wisconsin. Enter the Red Scare of the 50s, where if you looked hard enough, you could find a communist under every bed. Many artists during that period were subpoenaed to testify about their past to the House Committee on Un-American Activities. They basically had three choices. Name names of those with communist leanings in exchange for immunity from prosecution. And some people did that, including Elia Kazan, the director, and perhaps surprisingly, Burl Ives, also named names. The second choice they had was to invoke the Fifth Amendment, refusing to answer on the basis of possible self-incrimination, which is the route Lee Hayes took and many others. The third and most difficult choice was to defend oneself on the basis of the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, i.e., the right to freedom of thought and freedom of speech. It was difficult and the most courageous route because of the rampant anti-communist sentiment existing at the time. And this was the route that Pete chose. Now, I've obtained part of the transcripts of Pete testifying before HUAC. And there he is. August 18th, 1955, he was asked to be present to testify at a hearing of the House Un-American Activities Committee. And I've obtained part of the transcript of that day. And I want to reenact it for two reasons. First, as a cautionary tale, to remind us of the tyranny of those days, and to remind us, if we need reminding, that there are echoes of those times today. And the second reason I want to do it is to convey to you Pete's remarkable demeanor during the session. He was calm, respectful. You get the sense that he was morally convinced of the rightness of his position, and that indeed he was on the right side of history. I've asked my good friend Tim to play the role of Pete. So he's going to be over there, and I'm going to play the role of one of his interrogators. I have here, Mr. Seeger, a photostatic copy of the June 20th, 1947 issue of the Daily Worker. In a column entitled, "What's On?" appears this advertisement, quote, "Tonight, in the Bronx, hear Peter Seeger and his guitar an Allerton section houseman. May I ask you whether or not the Allerton section was a section of the Communist Party?
Sir, I refuse to answer that question, whether it was a quote from the New York Times or the Vegetarian Journal.
I direct you to answer.
I'm not going to answer any questions as to my association, my philosophical or religious beliefs, or my political beliefs, or how I voted in any election, or any of these private affairs. I think these are very improper questions for any American to be asked, especially under compulsion as this. I'd be very glad to tell you my life if you'd like to hear it.
What is your answer?
I will tell you what my answer is. I feel that my whole life I've never done anything of any conspiratorial nature. And I resent very much and very deeply the implication of being called before this committee. That in some way, because my opinions may be different from yours, or yours, Mr. Willis, or yours, Mr. Shire, that I am any less of an American than anybody else. I love my country very deeply, sir.
Why don't you make a little contribution towards preserving its institutions?
I feel my whole life is a contribution. This is why I would like to tell you about it.
I don't want to hear about it. I want to know whether or not you were engaged in a type of service to the Communist Party in entertaining at these features.
I have sung for Americans of every political persuasion, and I'm proud that I never refuse to sing to an audience, no matter what religion or color of their skin or situation in life. I have sung for hobo jungles. I've sung for the Rockefellers. I'm proud that I've never refused to sing for anybody. This is the only answer I can give along that line.
My question was whether or not you sang at these functions of the Communist Party. You have answered it inferentially, and if I understand your answer, you are saying you did.
Except for that answer, I decline to say anything further.
Do you understand, Mr. Seeger, it is the feeling of the committee that you are in contempt as a result of the position you take?
I can't say.
I am telling you that is the position of the committee. Thank you very much. Now, Seeger's refusal to cooperate led to a March 26, 1957 indictment for contempt of Congress. And for years, he had to keep the federal government apprised of whenever he left the southern part of New York State. He was convicted in a jury trial of contempt in March of 1961, and he was sentenced to 1 year in jail. But in May 1962, an appeals court ruled the indictment flawed and overturned his conviction. What helped was the international outcry as a result of his sentencing. He was at that point respected globally, particularly in Europe, and the international outrage was palpable, and I think that helped. From 1955 to the late 60s, Pete Seeger was blacklisted. He found it very difficult to get work in the United States, although occasionally he did university concerts, often for as little as $25. Enter Canada. At that time, a place relatively consistent with Seeger's political values. He found pockets of support here, people willing to bring him in and provide him with much needed work. In Montreal, record producer Sam Gesser played that role. In Toronto, in the area near Toronto, a secular Jewish labor camp in Brampton, Ontario, embraced the beleaguered Seeger. Anybody know the name of that camp?
Nivell.
Yes, Camp Nivell, which is a hotbed of folk music and left-leaning values. It spawned many artists, including a group some of us used to call the Canadian Weavers. Not the Kingston Trio, although Kingston, Ontario, you could say. No, it was a good one. The Travelers. You remember? How many remember the Travelers? There you go. And in Ottawa, it was union man Gil Levine, impresario Harvey Glack, and Max Sternvall who came to Pete's aid. They set up several concerts in Ottawa for Pete, including a memorable one in 1958 at Fisher Park High School. Now I know there's at least one person in the audience who was there at that concert, Gil Levine's daughter, Tamara, who's here tonight, and she has agreed to come up and share some of her memories of that night in 1958. Tamara, thank you.
Thank you. Was anybody else there? Were you?
You were.
Okay. So my dad, Gil Levine, was a young union researcher who loved folk music and who loved Pete and who was a socialist and believed in social justice and truly believed in the power of collective singing to change the world. And so I'd grown up with the Weavers records and Pete's music. And so it was very exciting when my dad, with his two buddies, Harvey and Max, decided to bring Pete to Ottawa. As Steve said, it was during the Blacklist. Pete was not getting work in the U.S. and Ottawa audiences were anxious to hear him sing. I know they each put up the grand sum of $25 to rent the hall, and I guess to bring Pete up from New York. I know that was a lot of money at that time, and it was a big deal to consider putting up $25. But he came, and he brought with him some not very well-known artists, Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. 1958. I was 7, and my job, which was a very big job at age 7, was to go up on the stage and pick a name out of a hat. They had asked everybody who came and bought tickets to provide their names and addresses, so that, of course, if there was another concert, they'd have a mailing list. And so the winner of the draw got a Seeger album. And so I remember being allowed to wear my party shoes and going up on the stage and pulling a name out of a hat. So that was very exciting. But I also remember the fabulous singing that night and how exciting it was to see Pete in person. Oh, the other thing that happened that night was Pete was always encouraging unknown and local artists to perform. And there was a man whose name was O.J. Abbott. Does that name mean anything to anybody? He was a lumberjack from I think around Chapleau, Quebec, and he knew all the songs of the lumber camp. And Pete invited O.J. Abbott to come up and sing a couple of songs for the audience, and we all knew who O.J. was, as well as Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee, and of course Pete.
Tamara, thank you so much.
Very kind of you.
The decade of the 60s contained perhaps the most significant of Pete's contributions. He contributed hugely to the civil rights, the anti-Vietnam War, and the environmental movements. Arguably, I think without fear of contradiction, I can say his major contribution was the modification and dissemination of what we know today as "We Shall Overcome." Now, I've been doing a lot of research on this song. It's a difficult history to unravel, and there's considerable controversy over the origin of this iconic song. But my own research has convinced me that it was a song written by this woman in the 30s that is the direct precursor of the contemporary version. Now, I wonder if anybody knows who that is.
Alberta Hunter.
No. No. I'm not surprised you don't know, because she has dwelled in song obscurity for years. Credit for We Shall Overcome has bypassed her. But in the 30s, this woman, who was a choir director and a composer from Cincinnati, Ohio, wrote a song, a gospel song, called If My Jesus Wills. I'll overcome, I'll overcome, I'll overcome someday. If my Jesus wills, I do believe I'll overcome someday. Try to get the key because I've been seen before. I'll overcome, I'll overcome, I'll overcome someday. If my Jesus wills, if my Jesus wills, I do believe I'll overcome someday. Now, Pete inherited a slower version of that song through all sorts of devious channels. He inherited a song called We'll Overcome Someday, in which the phrase, if my Jesus wills, had been replaced by deep in my heart. He then proceeded to change the will overcome, to shall, not for any grammatical reason, but because Pete believed the will, tighten the mouth. It was too mean, tight. Will, shall, open the mouth, expansively, better for singing. And those changes produce the song we know today. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Pete added several new verses, including this one. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand. We'll walk hand in hand someday. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Beautiful. Thank you. In 1957, Pete played this song before a fellow named Martin Luther King Jr., who loved it. Said Reverend King, "That song really sticks with you, doesn't it?" Unquote. Indeed, it stuck with an entire generation of civil rights activists, becoming the official anthem of the civil rights movement. A little addendum here. In 1960, Pete and 4 other white activists acquired the artist's portion of the copyright to the song. It was Pete, Zilphia Horton, Miles Horton, Frank Hamilton, and Guy Caroline. They held the artist's portion of the copyright, and they still do. In the last several years, however, this has been challenged by a foundation called the We Shall Overcome Foundation. a group which has been trying to get formal acknowledgement of Louise Shropshire's role in the song. And more importantly, I think, to remove all copyright restrictions on the song, i.e., get it placed in the public domain where it would be accessible to anyone without fee. We seem to be well on the way to this, and as I understand it, there's a trial to settle this issue due this coming December, so you might look for it. There's another song that's well on the way to that as well. This Land Is Your Land. The rights owned, the publishing house rights owned by the same company that owns the publishing house rights to We Shall Overcome, the Richmond Corporation. So that's his contribution to the civil rights movement, that song. And of course the song transcended the civil rights movement. Regarding the anti-Vietnam War movement, I want to highlight his creation of two songs, Where Have All the Flowers Gone? And Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. The first was a revival of a song Pete had written in 1955 while traveling to a concert in Ohio. Probably a student concert because he was blacklisted at the time. It's not generally known that he wrote the song with a fellow named Joe Hickerson, who was a fellow folk singer at the time. The song became a staple of the anti-Vietnam War rallies. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time passing. Where have all the flowers gone? Long time ago. Where have all the flowers gone? Picked by young girls, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn? Where have all the young girls gone? Long time passing. Where have all the young girls gone?
long time ago. Where have all the graveyards gone? Gone the flowers, everyone. When will they ever learn? When will they ever learn?
Now, Pete attracted even wider attention because of an incident in the 60s involving these guys. The Smothers Brothers. In 1967, Pete wrote a song called Waist Deep in the Big Muddy about a captain referred to in the lyrics as the Big Fool, who drowned while leading a platoon on maneuvers in a Louisiana swamp. The final lines were, every time I read the paper, these old feelings come on. We're waist deep in the big muddy and the big fool says to push on. The big fool says to push on. The lyrics were a fairly transparent reference to Vietnam as the swamp. And the big fool was Lyndon Johnson, who was escalating the war at the time. The Smothers Brothers, who were no slouches when it came to activism, invited Pete on their show to sing Waist Deep in the Big Muddy. And he did, and it was taped. But a nervous CBS cut the song from the September show, whereupon Tom and Dick objected strenuously, allegedly threatening to pull out of their shows unless Pete's song was reinserted. They won, CBS actually relented, and the song appeared in their show the following January. So all credit to the Smothers Brothers, who used their popularity as a vehicle for social protest. In 1966, Pete co-founds the environmental organization called Hudson River Sloop Clearwater, which was instrumental in cleaning up the Hudson River. Pete had this wonderful ship created. Once it was ready, Pete and his buddies, and anyone else who managed to get on board, sailed up and down the Hudson River, stopping and singing along the way to raise money to pressure governments to enact clean water legislation. As a result of this, and you can just imagine the ship going up and down the Hudson. We were just there, saw the ship at the Clearwater Festival. I'll talk more about that in a minute, but it's a magnificent ship. Just imagining it going up and down the Hudson, stopping at small towns and villages along the way. Peak performance, everyone singing, and money being raised to fight pollution in the Hudson River. As a result of his work, much of the toxic waste that's been dumped into the Hudson has actually been cleaned up, including the PCBs, which have been eliminated totally from the river. And the Hudson is cleaner now than it's been in decades. An amazing accomplishment. The Clearwater Folk Festival is a spin-off from this activism. And it was founded the same year as the organization, the Clearwater Organization, 1966. The festival is a wonderful celebration of Pete's music and folk music in general, which Janine and I can attest to since we've been there. We were just there in the spring. Has anyone been to the Clearwater Festival? Should try to get down there. It's quite an amazing setting. Pete was a great believer in this environmental maxim: think globally, act locally. I want to share another beautiful Pete story with you, which I learned when I visited Beacon, New York last year. Beacon is where Pete and Toshi live. For years, Pete and others had tried to remove an old landfill site from the banks of the Hudson River in Beacon, New York, where Pete and Toshi, as I said, lived. The story has it that one day, out of frustration, he and some cronies broke down the fence surrounding this dump. And what did Pete do? He sang. He gave an impromptu concert on top of the dump. You can just imagine. People came when they saw this, heard this and saw it, came and started singing with him. This was the catalyst for the removal of all the waste there and the creation of a park in its stead. And in 2014, the park was officially named the Pete and Toshi Seeger Riverfront Park. It's a lovely story. In 1980, the Weavers held a reunion concert in Carnegie Hall. Was anyone there? I tried to get tickets, could not. They were still remembered and adored by many. In a moment, we're going to show you a video of the beginning of the concert. It captures the extraordinary affection which the Weavers evoked and the profound anticipation which the concert engendered. The concert allegedly was organized as a result of Lee Hayes' wishes. Knowing he was dying, he apparently wanted one more Weavers concert. It was a magnificent, heart-rending evening. I've just seen videos. I was not there. The video opens, the one we're going to show you, with people filling into the sold-out concert and commenting on the importance of the Weavers in their lives. So we're going to play that video. Enjoy it.
I was raised on folk music and I love the Weavers, and so I'm here. I just sort of grew up with them. We're looking around for familiar faces from that era of our life, you know?
I was brought up on the Weavers. I love them. I haven't seen them in years together, and I'm really excited that they're here now.
Where do you come from?
California.
Ah, that's a long way.
Yeah, all the way from Wisconsin to see this concert and to roller skate.
When we saw that they were giving a concert here, I called from where we live, and all the good seats were already sold out before it was even listed.
I came back again tonight, I'm holding my money up. Maybe I'll be lucky and I'll get a ticket.
Good luck.
Thank you. But you should have seen the mob here last night. You should have been here.
Hey up, a rainbow, a rainbow, hey up, a rainbow, a rainbow, a rainbow, a rainbow, hey up,
compose myself a little bit. In 1982, Pete performed at a benefit concert for Poland's Solidarity Resistance Movement, the first public manifestation of Pete's decades-long personal dislike of communism in its Soviet form. In a May 1995 interview, however, Pete insisted that, quote, I still call myself a communist because communism is no more what Russia made of it than Christianity is what the churches make of it. That is my favorite all-time Pete quotation. I'm going to repeat it. I still call myself a communist because communism is no more what Russia made of it than Christianity is what the churches make of it. In 1984, the same government that prosecuted him for decades awarded him the Presidential Medal of the Arts. And who would have awarded that to him? Clinton. Clinton was the prez at the time. What was that?
What year?
94.
Oh, no.
Yeah.
84.
No, 94. Yeah. On May 3rd, 2009, there was a major event, the Clearwater concert at New York's Madison Square Garden. May 3rd, 2009. Why, you ask, May 3rd, 2009? Yeah, was May 3rd is Pete's birthday, and 2009 was his 90th. So there was a huge celebration in Madison Square Garden in New York. Everybody was there, except me. Dave Matthews, Bruce Springsteen, Tom Morello, Roger McGoon, Joan Baez, Richie Havens, Tom Paxton, and of course Arlo Guthrie, among others. Consistent with his longtime advocacy for environmental causes, all the proceeds went to the Hudson River Sloop Clearwater organization. It's clear to me that the three greatest influences on Pete Seeger were his father, the Kentucky miners he met when he was 17 years old, and Woody Guthrie, whom he met at the age of 20. First, from his father, he got his lefty ideals and his commitment to music as a collectively produced experience. I want to read you a wonderful quotation. It's fairly lengthy, but maybe no more than a minute, from Pete's father, Charles Seeger. You get a sense of where Pete was coming from. Here's Charles Seeger. Music, as any art, is not an end in itself, but is a means for achieving larger ends. To make music is the essential thing. To listen to it is accessory. Music as a group activity is more important than music as an individual accomplishment. Every person is musical. The musical culture of the nation is to be estimated upon the extent of participation of the whole population, rather than upon the extent of the virtuosity of a fraction of the population. The main question then should be not, is it good music, but what is the music good for? Charles Seeger. So Pete's desire to get people singing in his concerts and to alert them to the social implications of the songs he sings is clearly derived from his father's philosophy of music. Secondly, from the Kentucky miners, he got an inkling of the brutal world of manual labor, never part of Pete's own upper middle class existence. The authenticity of their songs and their quest for social justice had a strong effect on Pete's own folk singing career. And thirdly, from Woody Guthrie, he received hands-on learning of the reality of poverty and the reality of the brutal lives of working people as he and Woody wandered across America together. Also, he learned from Woody the importance of simplicity in the composition and execution of protest music. These were, as I see it, the main influences on Pete's life. What about the range of his own influences? What about Pete's legacy? Where to begin? For simplicity, I've divided his legacy into three categories: familial, musical, and moral, what I've called moral. Regarding the first, familial, Pete and Toshi had 3 children, 8 grandchildren, and 4 great-grandchildren. They are an ethnic and racial mosaic, symbolizing the embracing of diversity which Pete preached all of his life. And despite his long absences from home, he remained a loving husband and father to his children. Here's what his daughter, Pete Seeger, said during a conversation we had with her at the recent Clearwater Festival. Quote, "I had a father who loved me, and he spent as much time at home as he could afford. When he was away, he would send me games and puzzles that he invented, and he would look at what I did with them when he got home," unquote. So, according to Tina, despite Pete's long absences, the kids, at least according to Tina, felt nothing but love from their father. His musical legacy cannot easily be summarized. Pete often called himself a sower of seeds. Indeed, I think of him as the Johnny Appleseed of song. He influenced a myriad of artists, including Bob Dylan, Tom Paxton, Arlo Guthrie, Bruce Springsteen, and Joan Baez, among others. Indeed, Joan Baez fell in love with folk music at the age of 8 after attending a Pete Seeger concert with her aunt, a sower of seeds. By his moral legacy, I mean what he stood for as a person: an unwavering commitment to principle, a compassion for the underdog, for justice, equality, peace, and a clean planet. A lot of people rattle those things up, but in his case, they're absolutely right on. But at the same time, he was a humble, modest, authentic man, never succumbing to the arrogance and narcissism so often associated with fame. The only word that does him justice is an old Yiddish word which defies precise definition. But you immediately recognize such a person when you see one. Pete Seeger was a mensch. I wish to end with a tribute to Pete. This by putting together 2 songs with which he was intimately involved in the creative process. The first, "We Shall Overcome," we've already discussed. The second is a song which he wrote with Lee Hayes in 1949, a song which gives this lecture its title. It was first recorded by the Weavers, by Ed Hammer. It was written in support of the emerging progressive movements, particularly the labor movement, which was becoming increasingly energized at the time. Indeed, the song is replete with labor images. The hammer, the workman's tool, the bell refers to the bell which gets workers to work and ends their shifts and begins other shifts. Finally, the allusion to a song, to the song in Fiat Hammer, is an allusion to the history of labor songs and to the importance of raising your voice in collective protest. This is for you, Pete, and it's about you. You are the hammer of justice. You are the hammer of Pete. Pete, you are the bell of freedom. You are the bell of freedom. You are the bell of freedom today. Oh, beat in my heart. I do believe we shall overcome someday. And above all, Pete, above all, you are the song of love. You are the song of love. You are the song of love today. Oh, deep in my heart, I do believe we shall overcome someday. Rest easy, Pete.